started recording, so we're all good. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes. We're going to give some people more time to join, and we're going to get started around 6:05. Feel free to get some water. We'll be starting in around 2 minutes. Okay, we're going to give it 1 more minute. All right, it is 6:05. So I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation, Cyber Threat Intelligence and How Sharing is Caring, with our very gracious host, Grace Chi. Before we get started, I'm just going to give a very brief presentation on CSNP for anyone who hasn't been to one of our events before. All right, so CSNP stands for Cybersecurity Nonprofit. And our mission. So CSNP is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to promoting cybersecurity awareness, education, and improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in security. And our goal is to make security knowledge and training accessible so everyone can learn how to protect themselves. And we facilitate this learning and knowledge and career development through building a supportive, diverse, and inclusive cybersecurity community by hosting free events and programs like this webinar that you're all participating in tonight. What other types of events do we hold? We hold presentations, we hold technical workshops, panels, hackathons, and networking events. What other programs and contents do we have? We have weekly blogs that come out on various cybersecurity topics. We have a career resources page with anyone interested in breaking into cybersecurity with a detailed breakdown of various fields within the industry. We have cyber safety videos that we create for the public. And then we also are working towards our first boot camp. We have chapters all over the US and one in India. So if you're interested in joining a CSNP chapter, feel free to find us on Meetup and join and find events in your area. And if you're interested in starting a chapter in your area, you can also contact us at info@csnp.org. How else can you get involved? We're always looking for volunteers, bootcamp instructors. You can submit a blog. You can be a speaker for a presentation or a webinar like we're doing tonight. We're always looking for professionals to lead technical workshops and hackathons, chapter leaders to organize events, and we're always looking for leadership to help run the organization in areas like marketing, communications, program directors, and sales. And all of this is made possible through our sponsors and partners who help us keep all of these events free. So thank you to our sponsors and partners. And thank you, everyone. Here's our contact info if you would like to contact us. And now I will hand it back over to Grace so she can get started with her presentation.
Excellent. I will share my screen. All right, now April, if you could just confirm, and everybody in the chat, if you can confirm that things are looking right on your end. You see a title page PDF?
Yep.
All right, thank you so much. Perfect. And I will keep an eye on the chat, so feel free to try to distract me, and I'll try to keep it very engaging as we go along. But as April had mentioned, tonight we're here to talk about cyber threat intelligence, a brief introduction, and also about how sharing is caring based on some research I completed at the end of last year and published earlier this year. A quick introduction to who I am. My name is Grace Chi. I am the COO and the co-founder of Pulsedive Threat Intelligence. We are a New Jersey-based startup founded in 2017, and we offer a threat intelligence platform, data, solutions to support the CTI process, from collections to enrichment to analysis and automation as well. In addition to that, the third bubble you see in the formula that makes up who I am is that I love board games, particularly cooperative board games that are really stressful. And so one that I recently picked up because it's fun to play with the whole family is Marvel United, and I was playing Professor X and we were fighting Mystique. So if you used to watch X-Men back in like the 90s, tell me who your favorite character was. And then finally, the fourth bubble in the formula is art. I love producing art, both digital and hand-drawn. And so if you recognize who the character is on the rightmost of the screen, extra brownie points to you, put that in the chat. But why I'm here today is, Nightcrawler is a really good one, also my favorite. Why we're here today, and I'm putting the bottom line up front, is that CTI is an amazing space, and I would love to introduce some of you to it, or if you're just getting started, give you some tips and advice, as well as explaining how networking in CTI, the human component, is an asset and not an afterthought. And we'll dive into what that really means later. And I see some people in the chat saying Appa and Avatar 100%. So this was a birthday card I made for my nephew when he turned 7, which is why there's 7 balloons. And Appa already took a bite out of the cake. Zooming back out just to set the stage for why I present on these topics is because this graph that you see is something we've all been through. And whenever you take on something new, whether or not it's an entirely new domain like cybersecurity, or it's a specialization like CTI, or you're bringing on a new hobby, sometimes you go through this curve and you start with uninformed optimism. Wow, this thing is so exciting. You get paid really well. It's really interesting work. But then you move into stage 2 where you start to learn that there's a lot of challenges, and all you can start to see are all the things that are hard to do or gaps or weaknesses you might have. So you move into informed pessimism. And then in stage 3, which we're trying to avoid by having this presentation, is the valley of despair, which is the big sad. And when you hit stage 3, you either quit and you start with a different initiative and you go back to the beginning with your uninformed optimism, or you're able to push through and find mechanisms to then move into informed optimism, which is where you start to understand where your strengths are, you start to understand how to overcome some of those challenges, and eventually reach stage 5, which is knowing success, having a purpose, feeling like you know what you're doing, and then moving on to another challenge. And the reason why I like to share and showcase more about threat intelligence and more about collaboration within threat intelligence is so that we can all help persist and optimize to success, whatever that means to you. And this also applies to really anything you take on. But whenever I design my content, it's to help anyone at whatever stage they are get to that next step. And I saw somebody in the chat saying that they want to specialize in CTI. So hopefully you'll find something great in this presentation. So to get started, what is CTI? And CTI, Cyber Threat Intelligence, if you can in the chat, drop some keywords or some phrases that you think you've heard is related to the definition of cyber threat intelligence. And I'll give you a few moments. And it doesn't have to be a perfect definition. It could just be words that you've heard, areas. Okay, so I'm seeing them come in now. Incident response, useful hackers, that's interesting. OSINT, MITRE, okay, like MITRE attack is a big, something you probably heard a lot about. They just released a really interesting browser extension to make it really fast to look up tactics, techniques, IDs, and make it really seamless. You're not spending a lot of time copying and pasting stuff. Data sets, of course. Nation state actors, so APTs, threat actors, reports, absolutely, data literacy, risk, really big. Everything you do in security is related to risk and mitigating risk. Malware, okay, perfect, all right, great. So cyber threat intelligence, you could go to any vendor and they have a slightly different definition, but for now, we'll go to Gartner, one of the big analysts on the block. Can you still hear me? I got disconnected, it seems.
We can still hear you. I think you might be on mute now.
So sorry, I actually got booted out of Zoom for some reason. All right, let me just re-get my chat and everything open up again. Okay, you can still see my screen though?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, so sorry for that. I am back. Thank you everyone for your patience. Okay, so the definition for threat intel is evidence-based knowledge, including context, mechanisms, indicators, implications, and action-oriented advice about an existing or emerging menace or hazard to assets. Huge, so many words. This intelligence can be used to inform decisions regarding the subject's response to that menace or hazard. And, really at the end of the day, when you look at all the different definitions, it's really about data, which somebody mentioned, being contextualized, that informs action of some sort. And in cyber threat intelligence, it's related to cybersecurity, right? And one thing I want to be very clear about is what CTI is not. It is not conflated with a lot of pieces and parts of it, but it's more than just a notebook that tracks every threat actor, every APT, every group, any type of malware out there. It's a lot more than just paying for all the expensive feeds and the expensive platforms and tools. It's also not all the free and open source OSINTing everything. I think OSINT was mentioned, definitely a piece of it, but that doesn't mean just doing OSINT doesn't mean you have threat intel. It's not just about adding every indicator you can find. It's also not having a dedicated team member or even a team or security provider. And most importantly, it is not set it and forget it. Cyber threat intelligence as a domain, as a program within a security practice is not like, let me pay for this, let me ingest these things, and then we're done. It evolves over time, it matures. And so when somebody says, oh yeah, we did CTI, like that doesn't mean anything, right? Now, who and where? Who is doing CTI? In organizations, and this was a survey by the STANS Institute in 2021, most organizations have some sort of formal dedicated team or shared responsibility across different security groups. So the amount of security people that have CTI in-house has grown. So there was a 5% increase from 2020 to 2021. And just over half had a combination. So some service providers, some consulting, plus in-house teams. And then some were just a small sliver of service providers. And I could not tell you what that like 0.1% other means, but somebody else checked the other box. And so the amount of CTI capabilities are growing and the amount that's going in-house is also growing. But what does that mean? Where are you actually seeing CTI teams? First off, there are vendors. And by vendors, I mean products and technologies, startups that do cybersecurity. And a lot of times they have great CTI teams that have very skilled analysts that are doing research for their tools and their internal telemetry that they can then share as reports to their clients. There's also consulting teams that could be Big Four or MSSPs, and they function as professional services where you have a team of CTI folks or CTI teams within a larger team that is working with clients to develop more customized, tailored CTI. And that can include both setting up environments and also doing the like day-to-day active monitoring and analysis. There's also government, and that's not just at the federal level, but local, city, state, and military. And you've probably heard a lot about all that the US government and other governments are doing to invest in cybersecurity and enhance their intelligence efforts. And then finally, there are institutional and commercial. I'll lump them together for the sake of this presentation. So those are what you would traditionally think of as in-house security teams for universities, hospital networks, financial institutions, enterprises, manufacturing and supply chain, where they have a for-profit, business model or not-for-profit business model, and then there's a security team that supports the corporate security, and then there's a CTI team supporting that threat landscape and their stakeholders. So we talked about what CTI teams kind of look like, where you might work as a CTI analyst, but what are the feeder roles? CTI is typically not an entry or early career level role. A lot of times, especially right now with CTI as a growing space, it is something that you can start to specialize in maybe 2-3 years into your career in security, in IT, in military. And then, it's not something where you have to start within XYZ years. There are people who've been doing other careers for 15+ years that move into CTI as well. So there's no sort of limitation in seniority or being a junior to really be able to contribute to the CTI program. Very, very often, You will see people coming from security operations, specializing from security consulting, which can cover a whole lot of different types of roles, a lot from digital forensics and incident response, security engineering, IT and sysadmin is pretty popular for all types of security roles, and CTI is no exception. Government and military intelligence, a lot of ex-military, ex-army people find themselves in security or CTI and doing very well as technology reporting. And the reason why there are a lot of different feeder roles is because the skill set for CTI teams is quite varied. Some folks in the past have mentioned that in the chat said, oh, like reporting, data analysis. Yes, absolutely. Doing research, knowing how to work a pivot table, doing networking, scripting, doing forensics, being able to communicate that effectively. That is all part of what a CTI team does. And that doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in all of these, but typically a team will have complementary skill sets, or, you know, the more of these you bring from the get-go, the better. And then you develop out some other skills as your company or your team around you requires it. And I see some questions here, so I'll take a moment before we get into the intelligence cycle. Do you recommend a stepladder path as far as studies to build up your resume? What types of roles kind of move up to the security, cybersecurity positions? And I actually do have resources in a few slides that help you, like, if this is of interest to you, then take a look at these links. And I'll also be able to share with you all of the presentation and all the links as well post once we finish up here too. So just wait 1 minute. So the intelligence cycle is one of the underlying philosophies, foundations, modes of operation for CTI teams. And that goes from planning to collection, to processing, to analysis, to sharing or dissemination, and back to planning. And so this cycle continues, and it happens at both micro and macro levels. This is just a brief introduction. So I'll give you the high level of like what each of these mean, and then you could see if there's specific areas that you want to dive into further. So in a CTI team, what does planning mean? This is where you're gathering your requirements. You are setting the purpose of what you're doing, the scope of what you plan to do and what you're not going to do, and the priorities. And these are based on business needs or whatever organization you work for, whatever client you're working for, what their priorities are. To do this, you conduct stakeholder interviews, you define your core objectives, what your goals are, what your tasks are going to be, and if appropriate, what KPIs you're looking to hit. And at the end of the day, what you're finding here is understanding your risks, understanding who your consumers are of this intelligence, understanding what capabilities and operations you'll work within. And one thing to note here is when you're doing planning, you often work with people who are not just CTI, obviously. You have executives, you have technical teams, you have potentially clients and other users, and you have to learn how to speak their language, because if you go at them with a bunch of security jargon that makes a lot of sense for your CTI team, that will not be the most effective way to elicit their requirements. So at the end of the day, the planning stage is all about what do we care about as a CTI team and why. Then we move into collection. So you know what your landscape looks like, you know what your objectives are, and you need to start collecting data. They can come from both internal and external sources. And by that, network logs, past incident write-ups, reports that you can pay someone for or be writing yourself. This is also where you start to ingest threat feeds, you bring in IOCs, you look at TTPs, right? All the really cool vendors out there that are publishing reports. You might be getting alerts and newsletters from different certs, and it can also be from the open and dark web. So the collection phase for intelligence is rooted around what is the data that we need and from where are we getting it? Then we move into processing. That's where you take all those pieces of data that's collected that are kind of siloed alone wherever they are, and you start to enrich and contextualize that data. You can go into OSINT engines, like Pulsedive does offer enrichment as well. You could do scanning, you could do lookups, you could do footprinting, you can use your analyst's workbench of tools and extensions. There's a ton out there, and I do have a list for you as well for those who are asking. You can do counterintelligence. You can set up honeypots. These are phrases you've probably heard of before. And you can also do human intelligence. You can go to experts or go to people who are doing research and get more data from there to help you process all this raw information that you collected. So processing is really about, okay, we've collected things that we think are relevant. What's the bigger picture? Then, and this is where a lot of CTI analysts think it's so much fun and they really get to shine and be very strategic, you start to get into analysis. And this is where you have a bigger picture, right? You move from data to information to intelligence. And that's understanding motives. Who are these threats targeting? What is their behavior? What steps do they take? What is the impact that happens when they are successful? What steps, what mitigations can you put in place? And so these are actionable reports, and they're informed narratives that are produced by CTI teams to help protect organizations, to help them achieve their objectives. And here the key question is, okay, out of everything we've seen, what matters? Why? And to whom does it matter? And finally, you get into sharing. Sharing has become a very popular topic of discussion in the CTI community because there's so much work that gets done, but if you don't disseminate it and get feedback on it effectively, then it's a lot of work that doesn't end up taking the necessary steps. And so when it comes to sharing, you have to think about what audiences you're trying to reach, and if they're different, how to tailor all the research and the intelligence you've created to get them to understand what next steps. It's selecting the format, the level of timeliness, the level of detail, and how you're actually distributing this with clear actions and considerations that are highly relevant to the key stakeholders that you're reaching out to. And that might be a report, that might be a mailing, that might be an email, that might be a bulletin. And so when we're looking at the sharing phase, it's who needs to know and what do they need to understand. And feedback is very important because if you don't collect feedback, then you're not necessarily understanding if what you've done was effective, and then how to, when you go back into the planning stage, how to adjust your requirements, take the next step or revisit because, you know, maybe something was missed. And so at the highest level, this is what the intelligence cycle is. An example flow from a technical standpoint, because a lot of people are like, oh, but what technologies do you use? How does that look when it comes to different systems? In a very, very standard kind of team, you'll get intelligence sources, and that's internal and external, as we discussed. That might be malicious domains, news and advisories that's ingested by humans or in machine-readable formats. And a lot of times that can go into a TIP, which is a threat intelligence platform for enrichment, analysis, correlation, tracking, and reporting. And sometimes if you don't necessarily have a TIP or you use it in conjunction with a TIP, there will be data that's stored in Excel sheets, slideshows, and emails. But most people think that emails are a terrible platform to be saving threat intelligence related information, better for distribution. And then the tip, does not just live alone, right? We talked about internal telemetry, internal data, and kind of correlating that and having a database for threat intelligence. So a lot of times you'll be able to have bidirectional or push-pull with SIMs, security information event management technologies that help with detection and alerting, as well as like SOARs have grown in popularity that help with orchestration, automation, and response. And by no means is this the end all be all. You can add EDRs, you can add IDSs, but the threat intelligence platform is meant to be this foundation where you're tracking, reporting on a lot of data. Different analysts can go in and build out campaigns, analyze threat infrastructure. CTI teams today, they run the gamut, to be frank. It goes from very, very immature, where I like to call it CTI on a budget, and that is the college dorm mini fridge where, you know, you have the microwave and the fridge all together, fits like 2 cans of soda. And when I joke about that, I'm thinking of more of the supply chain teams that would have like an IT person who's also responsible for CTI. They have to only use free tools, open source tools, and they definitely don't have dedicated time and resources. But they are starting to build out a CTI program. In the middle, it's a little bit messy if you can't tell. That's where teams are starting to have some dedicated or shared responsibilities. They're starting to collect some feeds, some intelligence. They're running some of their own projects. They're looking at their internal logs. But it is a little bit chaotic because by no means is CTI a solved problem. Nothing in security is solved. And so there will be sometimes like graveyards of little things that are forgotten, little projects, the challenge of trying to operationalize lots of tools and lots of teams and their needs together. And that is by and large a lot of what CTI programs look like. And I mean this in the most loving way. Finally, there are the really mature fusion centers. And this is the Iron Chef Kitchen. And typically these are teams like from the financial sector that have a lot at stake, have been investing in security for a long time. They have a lot of capabilities, large teams that have specializations even within CTI. And a lot of times these companies and these organizations are at such a high level that they're producing intelligence not just for themselves, but that are shared more publicly as well. At the end of the day, it's a full spectrum, right? It's not just these three. It's just it runs along every stage of barely exist to super mature. The phrases at the bottom are just pieces and words that you might have seen. Some of the folks in the chat even mentioned some of these notes when I asked about the definition of CTI. And one thing to really note here is that no single person is an expert at everything. There is just far too much out there, not only just volume of existing knowledge, but the fact that the landscape is changing, the tactics and techniques are changing. So you really start with good foundations and you build from there. Now, this is what some of the attendees were asking about earlier. Okay, so, you know, the first 15 minutes or so, super interesting. How can I learn more? 4 links. 1, Katie's 5 cents. And so this is Katie Nichols. She has a cyber threat intelligence self-study plan. And she also has FAQs in getting started in cyber threat intelligence. These are great because they're bite-sized. They can give you just enough if you don't know that much and you want to learn about what it takes to get started. And the link is here and I can share them as well at the end. The second is Curated Intelligence's CTI Fundamentals. So this is blogs, papers, and other resources that cover not only CTI in practice or CTI for enterprises, but also CTI theory. The third, if you're the type that's like, give me the tools, just give me everything, give me the GitHub repo list of anything and everything you can find, you want to go to the Awesome Threat Intelligence repo. And so this is by Herman Slatman, and it has formats, free tools, paid tools, platforms, standards, books. Just like if you were like the type that's like, let me open up 500 tabs and just get started and learn all about it, go to Awesome Threat Intel. And then finally, this is a new addition to this presentation. It's the Mandiant CTI Analyst Core Competencies. Kudos to Mandiant for making this ungated. They set up a framework for what they deem as really core competencies for the CTI analyst role. And they get into specifics without being like extensively long about you need to be able to understand how to produce intelligence, you need to be able to understand networking and threats, but you also have to be a really effective communicator. So they break it up into 4 pillars and then they give you very specific examples. I saw somebody in the chat asked if the deck will be shared after the call, and I'm happy to share it with CSNP, and if there's a newsletter, April, or whatever is needed, I can give it to you to distribute. And in the chat as well, I'll, if we have time, I'll copy all of these over and send it to you. Okay. So that was the short introduction to CTI. Now, the second part of the talk was sharing is caring. So why bother? What does sharing even mean? Back to the SANS Institute CTI survey from 2021, you'll see that the amount of organizations that produce or consume CTI went up to 85%. And the amount of organizations that had no plans at all, like CTI, sounds cool, but we don't really want to do it, went down to 0. So the amount of interest and the value placed on building out CTI capabilities has been growing steadily over 5 years. However, you will hear a steady drumbeat of people saying that cybersecurity cannot succeed in a silo. And so there's phrases that you get like CTI networking is untapped, they're very siloed when it comes to sharing. We need better ways to share intelligence safely. Cross-sector, cross-government, cross-industry collaboration is essential. And we'll never get to our necessary level of threat intelligence because we're always running around with our heads cut off and our hands tied behind our back. We're doing it alone, and this is no way to be successful for threat intelligence. And there's been work. It's not like people have not been focused on this space. There are government initiatives that have supported sharing publicly and public-private. There have been technical standards developed, like Sticks via Taxi, that help with tool-to-tool sharing, so there's less effort in parsing and passing knowledge between tools and data fields. And there's even also like academic research about how to measure trust between participants in a trust group. And so all of this is really interesting to me. And as someone who works at a security startup, I was able to hear a lot about what different clients and different users from all over the world were struggling with. And one area that I saw was that so much work in CTI was still being done human to human. And security loves, because we're vendor driven, security loves to try to solve everything with tools. But what I was observing was a little bit different, where people were coming together to solve problems in not a very automated way. In fact, very manual, very intensive, a very human way. And so what I did was I dug into it a little bit deeper. I don't come from a traditional security background. And so as the co-founder of Pulsedive, when I started getting added to trust groups, I was surprised. I did not know that there was such a community of trust groups, events, and all of that taking place. And so I looked at it from my social sciences background even, and I was like, what's going on here? So I sought to benchmark the human collaboration that was taking place for CTI teams. Now, this does not mean like networking in the sense of like, how do I get a job, or how do I close this deal, or how do I get a promotion? This was purely, trust groups, conversations, working together to help you in your CTI responsibility. And so I looked at 3 different areas. One was how different methods stacked up, and we'll get into what those methods were. The second were how and why individuals were participating in CTI networking. And the third was the roles that organizations played. And the method, really quick here, was one of intelligence creation, right? I was doing novel research, and I had done my intelligence cycle. So I started with planning and discovery, where I set the purpose. I knew what area I was looking at, and I set the scope, what was and was not within my research. And then I started to write the survey. Then I went into collection. I distributed this through Google Forms. Nobody was paid for this. It was totally anonymous and distributed word of mouth. So newsletters, trust groups, friends of friends, social media, public posts, all the different ways that you get the word out there. After I finished the collection of responses, I got 140 or so good responses. I went into processing and analysis. And so in this case, analysis meant all the pivot tables in Excel in the world. So many pivot tables. I still have nightmares about the tabs that I had open in that Excel sheet. in that workbook. And in addition to the pivot tables, I also did qualitative review of open-ended questions that I put in my survey. And then finally, finishing with the analysis, I had my insights and I went into dissemination, right? That last piece, the sharing part of the intelligence cycle. And so I produced the report. It's a 45-page report. It's pretty bulky, but also very graphic. Put out some blogs, and today's presentation is another example of how I'm sharing the insights that I came up with. A few quick notes about who responded before we dive into the findings. This is inherently biased. We reached out free through networks, so people who work in CTI, who are against networking, who are not online, who do not want to share things with people, are not as likely to respond. So when we look at this, we understand that we did reach the part of the community that was active in CTI networking, social media, and involved in groups. When it came to the roles, it was pretty great. It was about half dedicated CTI primary responsibility, and then another half that had SecOps, incident response, leadership, threat hunting, and so forth. Pretty expected, pretty even distribution. The total years of experience were also pretty distributed. That's the second chart over here. And then finally, when it comes to years of CTI experience, this was also pretty much as expected, where a lot of people were 1 to 5 years because the amount of growth in CTI is huge. So we get a lot of career pivoters, like we mentioned. Then a solid amount that were 5 to 10, and then fewer and fewer in the more senior CTI roles. And that makes sense because CTI 15 years ago was not even called CTI. But the majority of our respondents were for-profit, either for-profit cybersecurity teams or for-profit like vendors and services. So our representation of government, nonprofit were a lot lower than we had hoped. So when you look at these results, just understand that it's mostly for-profit. Organization sizes were pretty well distributed, but it was also heavily English speaking, which, you know, would love to see a good global representation, but the survey was written in English and it was distributed through a heavily US-based network. So about 68, 69% US, 17 Europe, and then, you know, 6% or less in every other region. However, the people who responded often operated in multiple regions around the world, not just the one that they were based in. Diving into our findings, which is the fun part. This is not directly related to CTI networking, but I loved including it because this was a surprise to me. Our CTI respondents to this survey were really satisfied in their jobs. Over 70% reported being satisfied or highly satisfied. And I love to see that. It's consistent with what I've heard in my networks, that CTI has its challenges, but it is extremely interesting and it's strategic. And there's a lot of different ways to get involved and bring your niche experience. Only less than 10% said that they were unsatisfied or very unsatisfied. And a small note, if you're looking at CTI roles, the smallest, less than 100 employee orgs, and the largest, over 100,000 organizations, were the most satisfied. They were more than 71% satisfied. And the teams that were the 10 to 100,000 employer size, there was a little bit of a dip, more like 60s. Not bad, but just like not as high as the others. It made a little bit of a U shape. But the takeaway here is that the water is fine. Would love to help you. If you're interested in a career or just getting started, come talk to me afterwards. Okay, so earlier I had mentioned that I looked at 3 different spaces. One was methods. How did different methods stack up in CTI networking? And somebody asked, was that the entire organization size or security team size? For this, it was for your entire organization. So even if you worked at a massive company with 500,000 people, but your security team was 5, you would say 500,000 people. So moving into methods, what we found when asking about how often do you participate in things like peer-to-peer trust groups, those are Discord channels, Slack channels, social media and public forums, like Twitter, like LinkedIn, like Reddit, one-to-one direct messages, text messages, emails, Discord one-on-one, industry events, volunteer groups, paid membership groups like IFACs or dark web. There are no shortcuts to the strongest and the most effective networks. What people say online as conventional wisdom of like, yeah, you should do these 3 things, they held up true when we looked at the data. For peer-to-peer trust groups, social media and public forums, and one-to-one direct messages, these are all free, they're pretty peer-to-peer, and they're based on your personal reputation, your trust, and your contributions. And so when we compared the dimensions that I asked about, you'll see that these are the crowd favorites: one-to-one direct messages, peer-to-peer trust groups, social media. And you'll see here at the top, I asked, how much do you participate? The dark blues: frequently, sometimes, rarely, or never. And you'll see peer-to-peer, one-to-one, social media. But then just participating doesn't mean anything. So I asked 2 additional questions. One was, what is your perception of the quality of the stuff that you get from this, right? The data, the information, the intelligence. So I asked things like, do you find this valuable? Do you think it's high confidence? Do you think it's timely? Do you think it's actionable? And once again, one-to-one direct messages won out, followed by peer-to-peer trust groups. And social media was a little bit more volatile. So the perception of social media was a little bit lower, and there are a lot of challenges associated with social media too, especially Twitter, that can be distracting or noisy, but can very much so be leveraged for great threat intelligence research and awareness. Finally, just the perception doesn't matter. We also wanted to ask, what gave you real-world results? So if you participated in peer-to-peer trust groups, did that help you detect or prevent an attack? Did that help you during an attack? Did that help you in post-incident remediation or research? Did that help you with shared resources to get things set up in your program? And once again, peer-to-peer trust groups and one-to-one direct messages were really strong, and social media surprisingly came in as a very solid 3rd. And so what we found was that social media wasn't necessarily seen as high confidence or unique, but at the end of the day, the people who are participating in it found it as having value in their CTI work. One of the pieces of advice that I heard from other users is learn how to use advanced muting, learn what you're trying to get out of, like, let's say being on Twitter or being on LinkedIn, and just focus on curating your feed for your threat intelligence objectives, and don't get caught up with the other stuff. Don't get sucked into the noise if that's not what you're looking for. Then I asked, why are you participating, right? Forget about which specific method. What are the advantages or the benefits you get from utilizing these channels? And when I asked a series of different statements, people said they got valuable threat data, that it helped them stay aware of what's happening strategically, which is very important, helps them take proactive measures, and also find, vet, or understand new sources and methods of intelligence. So they come for the access, but you also stay for that awareness. And the theme that we found here was that CTI folks came for actionable, timely content. And it doesn't matter if it's raw data or intelligence, it was stuff that they could consume that was timely and relevant to something they could take action on, which comes full circle. That makes sense because that's the definition of threat intelligence. And it was good to validate that with our users. When we asked about what types of content was the highest value, though, it got really interesting. Overall, contextualized information, so analyze some information, came out first, and the more experience that you had in direct CTI, the higher contextualized information scored. Second was processed intelligence, then raw data meaning like IP addresses, IOCs, hashes, signatures. Then came others' advice, opinions, technical support, and emotional support. Some people laugh that I put emotional support on, but it's true. When I asked, why do people join? What benefits do you have? When I was scoping out the survey, people said it was really nice being in a group where you could share struggles. It just wasn't the top reasons, the top value they got out of it. But depending on what your responsibility was, this ranking changed quite a bit. So you'll see in incident response, raw data shot up to first place, whereas contextualized information, which is number one overall, dropped to fourth place, tied for fourth with technical support. Then if you work in security operations, contextualized information comes all the way back up to first place, where raw data drops to sixth. And if there's any of you in the in the chat that are in security operations, maybe you'll understand, because raw data can create a lot of false positives and is not very useful or actionable in your role. In executive leadership, it kind of, evens out. And these are all because you have to understand, when you participate in CTI networking, different audiences are looking for different types of information. So when you contribute or when you participate, you can also keep in mind the roles that you have and the roles that others have to create value for their community. In organizations, which was the last question I asked, what we found out is that when it comes to CTI networking, it's mostly just on individuals. Individuals barely did that much like reporting or measurement of the effectiveness of their networking, but they built out time, but a lot of that time was kind of on their own time. So while personal sentiment about networking and collaborating was very strong in the agree, like I encourage those who report to me to participate, CTI networking is essential for doing my job, it's a part of my time and responsibilities. The organizational questions were a little bit weaker. They were more just neutral. Things like, I'm rewarded for participating in networking. It's easy to get new methods approved. It's well-defined or structured in my area of work. And so even though people understand that this is highly valuable, the fact that it's kind of tied to yourself means that there's a lot of opportunity for organizations to simply acknowledge the value they're already getting, and then the ability to be more intentional, strategic, and inclusive about what that means for their team. Because once again, all of this collaboration is to help support organizational objectives. Top line things like staying strategically aware, being actionable, being timely. A couple key takeaways, and I'll wrap this up quickly so we have some time for Q&A, is that the survey's strongest consensus is that CTI networking is important for team members at every level. There was 91% agreement, which was the highest out of any question I asked anywhere on this pretty long survey with like 75 or 100 questions. And that only went up with more years of experience. That went up to 93%. And so really, if you're looking and you want to get started, do not be stopped by imposter syndrome, and take the advice of current CTI practitioners for the community, which is to participate. So start small, start where you can, get involved in a good community, find and follow people that are doing things you find interesting, so you're surrounded by that discourse, you know what's going on, you have some awareness. To build trust, to always be trustworthy, to actively develop trust, and be a good analyst. Get into top circles by contributing your unique intelligence. Make sure you're always using critical thinking capabilities and sound analysis principles. And also a great way to build trust is to pick a niche that you have skills in. You don't have to be the best at everything. If you're good at translating languages, if you're good at writing scripts, if you're good at making really good reports that are very effective, lean into that, and then people will start to come to you and you can start to ask them for their different areas of expertise, and always hold yourself to the highest professional standards. You don't want to burn trust. It's very easy to lose trust, and it's very hard to recover from that. And then finally, always stay careful and strategic. Understand why you're going into these trust groups or why you're collaborating. Understand what the company needs, what the business needs are, understand what the team needs are. Have a plan to do something with the data or the information that you collect, because having lots of stuff is great, but unless you're putting them into action, it's a use of a lot of effort. Always trust and verify who you're talking to, what data you're using. And then while you should be very skeptical of data shared, be generous to those who are sharing it, assuming that they don't have bad intent, because it takes a lot of courage to put yourself out there. And finally, select the groups and select your efforts based on impact. There are more than enough channels out there. And if you're like me, you have way too many Discords, way too many Slack groups, way too much activity on social media. But pick, like, I would say 2 to 3 where you feel like you can contribute and you're getting value by participating. And then, move on or leave the rest on the back burner, because don't stretch yourself too thin by trying to do it all. You can try a lot, but there's always going to be more groups. So be strategic with where you're putting your very limited time and effort. I'll leave some room for questions, and also, April, if I had missed any key questions earlier, feel free to add them here. And I'll leave this screen up as we talk. It has my email, it has the link to the full report. It also has Twitter if you want to give me a follow, and my LinkedIn end of the URL as well. So, and let me look at some of the questions. So I have some from Kevin. Thank you for adding them. There's 4. Let me work through them. Are there any misunderstandings about CTI that make a difference that you'd like to highlight? CTI incorporates a lot of different skill sets. And in my kind of outsider view, I've seen that there's a few tensions that are coming together, and the teams that do the best are the ones that understand these different perspectives. So 1, there is the kind of traditional security background. So like IT folks, computer science folks, they understand networking really deeply. They love digging into logs and running analyses. However, there's also the military or the traditional intelligence roles that struggle because they might not have the same technical background, but they understand intelligence and the purpose of intelligence. And then the third force that I see is the business side, right? What is the risk? What is the financial impact? And so all 3 of these perspectives are very strong and very relevant to CTI, but you need to learn to speak across those different perspectives, across the jargon, and tie them together, because ultimately these 3 spheres is where the Venn diagram overlaps. That's where CTI is at its most powerful. Since some CTI teams are smaller, does that mean there's an issue with getting support? This is a really, really interesting question that you asked, because there's some, I wouldn't say controversy, but there's some challenges where people say a single CTI person is limited in their resources. So can they be as effective as then putting together more people at once? I think no matter what, resources are limited, but CTI teams can be very successful starting off small, not biting off more than they can chew, not going for huge operationalization, but figuring out right now, when you do your planning, what are some things that we understand, what are some gaps we need to fill, what are some questions we need answered, and get some quick wins and build and build and build and iterate over time. So I wouldn't say just because there's one person or just because it's a small team, they will have trouble getting support. I think it's a matter of choosing your scale based on the resources you have at hand. That doesn't mean it's easy by any means. It doesn't mean it's not messy. It doesn't mean that the space isn't changing over time. But that's where networking can help a lot, where you can leverage other people in the industry that have experience. They can help avoid a lot of pain and suffering and wasted effort by being connected, even if they're not directly in your company and without sharing anything you're not allowed to share. Let's see, what CTI communities will you recommend? So that's a really interesting question as well. I would say, like, trust groups and communities are difficult. People often need to vouch for you before you get in, and you might not even know about some of the more private groups until you're already deep in. The best way to get started is to put yourself in those public channels, attending B-Sides events, following people on Twitter, researchers on Twitter. If somebody's publicly available and they engage with their audience, if they put out a report, say, hey, that was great, or provide some feedback, right? Say, this was really useful, and start those dialogues. That's how you'll start to hear about the communities. But then there are also communities that do have somewhat of a public-facing presence, like Curated Intelligence. They'll share reports and information on the Ukraine war or on CTI fundamentals, like I showed you. And so they have tweets and posts you can follow, and they also have the private trust group that you need to be vouched for before you can join. And then should I expect long hours doing CTI work? I know how to best prepare myself, can be up for a lot of hours. This depends on the types of company you work for. One of the challenges for CTI analysts and teams right now is the fact that if you get too caught up in current intelligence, like the latest news, what's happening in the world, there's exploits every day, right? There's CVEs every day. You can get caught up in a cycle where you're not doing the more meaningful, deeper work that's really tailored to your company, and you're getting caught up just trying to stay on top of the news. And there's a careful balance because you need to be aware of what's happening externally, but in order to make long-term meaningful impact within your CTI program, you can also build out and pick the important, but maybe not like right now, dumpster fire urgent stuff so that you can succeed in the long term. I know personally, there's plenty of employees on CTI teams that have a great work-life balance, and I know the opposite. So like any other company, it really depends on the culture and the team that you join. But I do know that CTI folks, a lot of them who are passionate and like to do threat intelligence as a hobby on top of their work, they have struck a very nice balance, but that's not always what happens right when you're getting started. It's a lot of learning and it's a lot of drinking from the fire hose. But an important piece to that is also understanding where to stop for yourself too. Now let's see. There's shared groups, are there communities with a presence, and are communication skills essential in this role? Okay, just looking at some other questions here. Communication and those core skills sometimes get slept on a little bit, but I would say that it's absolutely essential. If you are not the person that loves communicating with people or with different business teams, that means you're probably in a CTI team better if somebody can complement that in your group. But the ability to have done all this research and then to bring that to the audiences who have the power to take action, whether that's mitigation, whether that's further investment, and make them understand, influence them to understand the reasons for that, that is how you can continue building out your CTI program. So verbal, written, graphic communication, data visualization, so it's not just tons of Excel sheets or really, really long reports, that is absolutely effective. And that will be important in any role that you have once you get to like at least like a mid-tier, senior tier, management tier. Any other questions? These are a lot of really great questions. Thank you for the chat. And April, let me know if I've run on too long.
No, take your time. If you want to continue answering questions, all up for it.
Okay, perfect. Let me see. Okay, one other question. The last one I'll answer for now, but please feel free to reach out to me separately through the methods that I put on the slide. Is if I were to reach out to you or another CTI professional, how do I best utilize their time? Here, I would say don't, and this is just my personal preference and things I've heard from other CTI professionals, don't go and say, hey, what certification should I get? Hey, what books should I read? The reason I say that is because so many really bright, wonderful researchers and leaders in the space have already put their favorite books out there, a self-study plan. There's more than Katie's, but I did put Katie's because it's often cited and referenced. And you can also look and you get like 10 different really popular, reputable people who've all put their books on. So when you want to reach out, if you're doing an informational interview, dive in deeper, really ask them about their experience, their advice, do your research on them. And this is not just for CTI, it's really for any professional that you want to do an informational interview with. And hopefully you have you've done enough research to know, hey, I think I'm really good at this and I'm interested in, XYZ threat actors or financial fraud, and I'm looking at this. Do you have any experience or is there anyone else I can talk to? Or what did you think of this report? Or I'm working on this topic. Like, is there something good? The more tailored and the more refined you are in your ask, the more valuable it will also be for the other person. So try to avoid just asking generic stuff like, what would you say? Or like, you know, what are the 3 things you wish you knew? Or what questions would you ask in an interview? Just because a lot of times I encourage other CTI people too, who say they get those questions a lot, to put out a post so they could just reference that post. Hopefully that makes sense. And yes, so to close out here, there will be a recording of this whole presentation that is released on YouTube. I will share the presentation as well with April, and I'll drop in the links as well below in the chat as April's wrapping up. And feel free to add me as well to continue the conversation. I would love to be the first, hopefully not last, friendly face if you're just starting to get involved in the CTI world. All right, April, back to you.
All right, thanks, Grace. This was such a great presentation on CTI. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else learned a lot also. As Grace said, this recording, it will be uploaded onto YouTube later this week, and in addition, on CSNP's past presentations page, we will also include the link to the slides, so you can see that also. And for anyone who's interested in learning more about CSNP, you can go to our website, csnp.org. And if you're interested in giving a presentation similar to what Grace did, feel free to fill out a speaker request form so we can get you signed up. And yeah, that's it from me. Once again, thank you so much, Grace. This was a great presentation.
Thank you so much as well.
All right, I'll just give you a few more seconds. I know you said you were going to drop some links.
Yes, I did drop the PDF links. I think some of them didn't automatically hyperlink, but they're all in there. And then I will also drop the report link in the chat as well. And so this is ungated. And then you want my LinkedIn link as well. Here, I'll drop it. You can add me 1 second. All right, there you go.
All right, perfect. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Grace. Have a good night.
Have a good rest of your evening. Bye.
Bye.